All right. Hi, everybody. So welcome to History 110, U.S. History since 1865. I'm looking forward to a great 6 weeks. This obviously is a 6 week course. Things are going to move, move pretty fast, which is something I'll get to in more detail a little bit later. But anyway, so it's History 110, U.S. History since 1865. I'm your instructor. My name is Derek Schloss. And basically, this is the welcome, introduction, and orientation video. Actually, I think I'm going to make this two separate videos. And so the first video, this video, is going to be specifically about, first of all, I'm going to talk about who I am, my background, just tell you a little bit about me, why I'm teaching this class, and in my situation and everything. And then I'm going to talk about thinking historically. I'm going to get us, wet our beaks, so to speak, with regards to historical thinking. That'll be, essentially the first video. The second video is going to be essentially course logistics. So I'm going to go over not the syllabus like word for word, but I'm going to go over aspects of the syllabus. I'm going to go over the Canvas page, or actually show you guys how to sort of navigate through the Canvas page, talk about how to access the course textbook, and look at some of the assignments, reading/lecture quizzes, and primary source questions assignments. Those are going to be basically your weekly assignments. So yeah, I'll go over a little bit about those, talk about like course time commitment. So anyway, yeah, that's the purpose of this video, or really these videos. Okay, so first of all, who am I? So first of all, I'm not a doctor. Don't call me Dr. Schloss. But I am in the process of becoming, I guess, technically a doctor, or getting my doctorate. So yeah, I'm a PhD student here at Arizona State University. I'm actually entering my 4th year in the PhD program. So I'm technically a PhD candidate. Basically, I'm gearing up to write my dissertation, and then doing a lot of teaching, like in this history teaching, like in this class, for example. So let's see, maybe briefly, I could just mention my area of interest. So yeah, I'm an Americanist historian. I study early United States history and the history of capitalism, and really economic history. And so basically my plan is to write a dissertation on, when someone tells you like they're writing a dissertation on something, that's, another way to put that is that's their area of research. Their research interest is in this or in that. So basically, I'm interested in the antebellum free trade movement. So my topic, for the most part, actually deals with the other part of U.S. history, the first half of U.S. history, as opposed to the second half of U.S. history, which is what we're talking about in this class. But yeah, the antebellum free trade movement, and looking at especially northern mercantile, or basically merchants, and how they contributed to arguments and ideas and the development of organizations and institutions that were against the protective tariff. That was a big issue in the antebellum United States, starting in 1816, but continuing into the 1820s, 1830s, all the way really to the Civil War, and actually after that as well. So basically taxes more generally, but especially tariffs, taxes on imported goods were a really big deal. Americans talked constantly about and argued vociferously about tariffs. And for a while, the people that really wanted protective tariffs, and specifically they wanted protective tariffs to protect nascent American manufacturing. So kind of the earliest manufacturing interests, especially in places like New England, and sort of in like the middle states, like Pennsylvania, for example. Those were the centers of like the earliest examples of industrialization, large scale industrialization in the early to mid 19th century. So they wanted protections against imported goods to protect their businesses, basically. There were a group of people that opposed that were in favor of basically quote unquote free trade. And that's the people that I'm focused on in my research. So anyway, if you're curious about that, you can reach out to me. I would guess most of you guys don't really care, but anyway, that's what I'm studying. A little bit more about me. Yeah, I moved to Arizona. I'm actually from California. I lived in California my whole life up until a few years ago when I started in the PhD program. So I moved about 3 years ago, actually summer 2020 here to Arizona to attend the Arizona State, or to begin the Arizona State PhD program right in the middle of COVID, obviously, which was an interesting time to move. I also have 2 young kids. Two girls, ages 8 and 4. And so them and my wife and the family dog all moved out here a few years ago. And we like it here overall in Arizona, outside of the brutal, punishing summer heat, which if you're in Arizona, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, we like it here overall. And yeah, when I'm not, I don't have a whole lot of time, a whole lot of free time with the whole getting a PhD thing and, teaching college level, history classes, and then like raising a family. But outside of that, I'm interested in, actually, I'm a big fan of NBA basketball. So I watched a lot of the NBA playoffs. My team is the Golden State Warriors. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 12 years. So yeah, I'm a big Golden State Warriors fan. And yeah, I try and get in a few runs a week as well. I'm not that in that great of shape, but I try and sort of stay in shape, through doing that. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. Let's get into kind of the second order of business here. Let me just finish up what I was saying. So yeah, I'm in the process of getting a doctorate, but I haven't received my doctorate yet. So yeah, please don't call me Dr. Schloss, just Derek or Mr. Schloss or whatever is fine. Just Derek is totally fine, actually with me. So let me talk about history more generally and kind of getting I want to kind of get us to think historically a little bit. So let me pose this question. So here's the question: why study history? Who cares about history? Why study history? Why, why is history important? Or even, is history important? Certainly not everyone agrees that history is important. I'll get to that in a second. So why study history? I'll give you a second to kind of think about that on your own. Why is, if you're going to make the argument that history is important, what kind of argument would you make? What's the importance of, it's a lot of things you could do with your time. Why is studying history something people like me decide to do, not just do with their time, but devote, a certain portion of their lives to? Well, if it's important, why is it important? Well, I think there's, different answers to this, right? So some people say those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it. Those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it. I've heard that many, many times, right? And kind of inherent in this idea, those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it, is an assumption that history repeats itself. History repeats itself. So those are kind of two interconnected ideas that are kind of out there about like why history is important. Like, be careful, study history because history repeats itself, right? If you ignore the past, then you're doomed to repeat the past. You're going to make the same mistakes that people did back then. I think most historians would say that there's validity to both of those ideas, but that they're also problematic, which I'll get to a little bit more in a second. Another reason to study history, I think, is the stories, really interesting stories, right? Oftentimes what really happened, quote unquote, the truth is stranger than fiction. So the most inventive fiction writer would have a hard time coming up with a lot of the things that actually happened in history. It's strange. It's even, again, stranger than fiction. History is full of amazing stories, right? And I think a part of what draws historians to history and even just people that, amateurs that are interested in history, is, the fascinating stories, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think the, study of history should go beyond just kind of little interesting anecdotes and stories, right? It has to be sort of more rigorous and analytical than that. And that's what we're going to strive for, I think, in this class. But yeah, there's cool stories in history for sure. I don't mean to necessarily downplay that. Of course, not everyone agrees that history is important. So some, I've heard this many times, some people seek to undermine the study of history or history itself, right? By asserting that history is, quote unquote, just a bunch of facts. A lot of people say that history is just a bunch of facts, right? Here's what I would say about that. Certainly facts are important. There are certain facts. George Washington was the first president. That's a fact, right? Abraham Lincoln was president during the American Civil War. That's a fact, right? That's not the kind of stuff that historians argue about. That's not particularly interesting, but stuff like that is sort of the basic building blocks, right, of history. So yeah, facts are certainly important. I would say that if your preconceived notion is that history is just quote unquote just a bunch of facts, if that's been your experience with history in history classes you took in high school or even in college, or your experience with history more generally, I would say that you had some bad history teachers, bad history instructors, because history at its core is not just a bunch of facts, right? History, academic history at least, is really about interpretations, right? So there has to be a common set of facts that we all agree upon. But history is constructed, right? Historians look at primary documents. And when you look at the primary documents, actually, there's a lot of facts, quote unquote, to argue over. There's some basic things that are inarguable, but there's just kind of, just on a basic level of just what happened. It certainly depends on the specific, development or event or time period that you're looking at. But potentially there's a lot to dispute in terms of just what happened. And then when you get into the level of meaning and interpretation, and causation as well, which is very tricky, but some historians do devote a lot of time and energy and effort into causation. What caused the Civil War? What caused the American Revolution? It's enormously complicated. Very smart people have very different views of that, right? People that have devoted their lives to the study of, again, the American Revolution and the American Civil War and things we're going to talk about in this class: Reconstruction, the New Deal era, the rise of the late 20th century conservative ascendancy. People, smart people have strong disagreements about that, right? So really the study of history and history itself is definitely not just a bunch of facts. I want to disabuse you of that. I want to dissuade you of that notion. Let me go back though to the first two things that I mentioned, which are those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it, and history repeats itself. Again, there's some validity to this, certainly. And I think that, let me back up a little bit. So I think another thing that's inherent in both of those ideas, again, history repeats itself, those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it, is like there's an assumption that there's a connection between the past and the present. And I think this is a tricky topic. Historians have, I think, mixed feelings about this. Certainly for historians, I think, and especially for someone like me, like what's interesting about a certain topic, like to a certain extent, is its connection, and in a lot of cases is the topic's connection to things that are going on in the present day. Like that's what gets you thinking about it kind of in the first place. That's the initial impetus for your interest in a certain topic, right? So certainly there are connections that are interesting, and I think especially in a class like this, it's interesting to bring up. So, for example, one of the things I'm going to talk about in the second video. When you get to the second video, I talked a lot about populism, and I talked about populism in a historical context versus populism in a contemporary context, right? A lot has been made about populism, especially right-wing populism in the populist movements in the United States and in Western Europe and in and in other places like Brazil and in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia. And yeah, it's interesting to make connections between that, or to even just kind of get your interest in populism and the idea of populism invigorated by that, by the contemporary relevance of it, and then to look at it in the past and think about kind of the similarities and differences between, let's say, the late 19th century populists and contemporary populism, right? Or what's labeled as certain incarnations of contemporary populism. So certainly connections between the past and the present are interesting, but I think they're problematic, and most historians would agree with me that it's problematic to just think of history that way, or even primarily to think of history that way. So let me talk a little bit more about that. So I think it's really important to remember that the past, and the more you dig into the past, and especially you read primary documents, the more you kind of realize that, or at least that's been my experience with this. The past is a foreign country. The past is in many, many ways not like the present, even in the case of what we're talking about in this class. So, we're going to start basically after the Civil War, starting with emancipation in essentially 1865. So, if I was teaching the first half of U.S. history, if this was a first half of U.S. history class, I would start all the way back in the time of indigenous peoples before European incursion and into, settlement and exploration of the New World. So that would be centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries ago. In this case, we're going to start, really, what is that, 100, beginning my math wrong, but 130 years ago. I guess it's about a century and a half ago, right? Give or take a little bit. So overall, it's not that long ago, but things were very different back then. Things were even very different, very, very different 100 years ago. And even 50 years ago, 40 years ago, when you talk about the upheavals of the 1960s and the conservative, sort of counter-revolution to that in American politics and culture and society and economics, which we're going to talk a lot about in this class. So that was only, 50, 60 years ago. But that was a really different time in many ways. So the past is a foreign country. The past is different. People are different in the past. They have different values and mores. They see the world differently. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's possible, what's assumed to be possible, what's assumed to not be possible is very, very different. So I want to again kind of whet your beaks with that idea, and kind of along these same lines, I would say watch out for what I call generational chauvinism. Generational chauvinism. So what is generational chauvinism? So generational chauvinism is the idea that modern people are inherently better, essentially wiser, more virtuous, et cetera, than people who lived in the past, and are therefore qualified to pass judgment upon the people that lived in the past. So I would submit to you, and in fact, I think most historians would take this position and agree with this, that people in the past are in a sense just like people in the present. I guess I'll qualify that in a second, but people in the past are in an important sense just like people in the present. So besides being heavily influenced by genetics, biology, so we're all influenced by how human beings evolved, right? Our genetics, our biology, our basic psychology, and people that lived 150 years ago are influenced by that, and were influenced by that. I don't think genetics and biology has changed that much in 150 years, or even in the past 5,000 years, let's say. Both sets of individuals, people in the past and people in the present, are heavily influenced by the customs, the values, the attitudes, the beliefs, and the established institutions of the time period in which they live. And what they think about race, what they think about gender, what they think about democracy, their attitudes about nationalism, about almost everything are going to be shaped by, again, customs, mores, values, attitudes. So I would think about that. I would be very careful. And I think there's a tendency, especially in the past 5 or 10 years, to really a lot of people have a strong proclivity for passing judgment on the people in the past. And I think it's tricky. I think, on the one hand, certain attitudes, certain developments, certainly by our modern day standards, or really by any standards we can say are wrong. Slavery, and we're not going to really talk about slavery in this class because slavery, we're going to start when slavery was over in 1865. Or at least institutionalized slavery, legalized slavery, was over in the United States in 1865. But we are going to talk a lot about the legacy of slavery and attitudes about race, which are influenced, certainly were influenced and continue to be influenced by the legacy of slavery. So now I forgot what point I was making here. Let's see. What point was I making? Stay with me. I'll come back to it here. Yeah, so we're all influenced by the customs, values, attitudes, beliefs of the time period in which we live. Oh yeah. So I think it's okay to, for example, Reconstruction was a noble project in many ways. We're going to talk about this, but Reconstruction really faced a white backlash, especially in the South, but even in the North to a large extent. And the promises of the Civil War, of not just emancipation, which continued, right, but really incorporating African Americans into the broader body politic. In many ways, that failed. At least initially. And I think we can pass judgment on that and say that that's wrong, especially based on our modern day. We have the benefit of hindsight. We have certain customs and values and beliefs, and we could say that's wrong. But at the same time, I think that's the easy part. I think the harder part is to kind of leave our judgment at the door and really try and understand the time period, understand why things unfolded the way they did. Passing judgment, when you have the benefit of 150 years of hindsight and modern ways of thinking about things, that's very easy. Understanding people, stepping into their shoes, and we can never do that to a certain extent. We're all products of our upbringing and surroundings and context and cultural and economic and political context, right? But to the extent that we can, I think we should try to step into their shoes and try and figure out why they thought the way they did, why they made the decisions that they did, why things unfolded the way that they did. That's the job ultimately of a historian. That's what we're going to try and do essentially in this class. Also, I would say, to the idea that history repeats itself, this is interesting. Certainly history does in many ways repeat itself. So again, there's undoubtedly a lot of truth to this, but I would say at the same time, this can be overwrought. I think there's a lot of examples where history actually doesn't repeat itself. And I would say when you get into, if you're really talking precisely, specifically, history rarely plays out exactly the same way as it did in the past, and certainly is not guaranteed to repeat itself, even in a general sense. Similarly, just because developments are trending in a certain direction does not mean that they will continue to do so. We think we know what life is going to be like, what American politics are going to be like, how technology is going to change in 10 years and 20 years and 50 years, but we actually don't. And you can look back at what, 150 years ago, what people were talking about, things were going to be like 50 years after the time they were alive. And in some cases they were right. In most cases, they were very misinformed. Their guesses were wrong. So we want to kind of keep that in mind, right? So at the turn of the century, for example, many intellectuals were absolutely certain that religion was on its way out. So, around the turn of the 20th century was kind of the what we think of as, quote, modern science, which certainly has antecedents back to the scientific revolution in Europe and even before that, the Enlightenment. So it's certainly, I don't mean to say that, quote, modern science emerged in around the year 1900, but modern science seemed to many intellectuals, to many people, to be making religion increasingly outdated, antiquated, irrelevant. And that seemed to be where things were headed. But of course, I would say in most ways, that's not how things turned out. In a place like a part of the world like Western Europe, certainly has become more secular, although there still are a lot of religious people. America, in many ways, has become more secular, but religion, I would say quite obviously, is still an important force in American, not just society, but American politics and American economics. And we haven't seen a mass conversion to atheism in the world. I think in some ways people have replaced religion, sort of politics is the new religion for many people, which is maybe kind of another subject. But anyway, people were sure that religion was on its way out. It was going to be resigned to the dustbin of history, and I would say that was pretty much unequivocally wrong. Very few, by the same token, very few people thought that the Soviet Union would fall, but it did. I think we have a tendency from our modern day point of view to assume that the way things unfolded was the way they were inevitably going to unfold. And so the people that were surprised by that when those developments actually happened were sorely mistaken and horribly misinformed. Again, we have the benefit of hindsight. What I'm describing, by the way, in academic history, we call this teleology, right? So basically, the story of history is like what gets us, we go to step one and we go to step two and we go to step three, and eventually we have enough steps to get us to the present, right? Thinking, and you could see how that fits in very much with thinking about the past in terms of the present and explaining how we got to where we did. And again, that can be interesting, certainly. I don't mean to necessarily denigrate that way of thinking, but there's a more interesting way to think about history again, which is that when you actually read documentation, secondary sources, primary documents of the 1980s and the 1970s and 1980s, and people talking about what's happening with the Soviet Union, what's the current state of the Cold War, almost nobody was predicting that the Soviet Union was going to fall, the Berlin Wall was going to come down, and America was going to be proclaimed the sole remaining superpower. And people that claim that they were right about that, go back to the record. They probably they probably are mistaken, right? Very few people, could have predicted that, but it indeed happened, right? Very few political pundits thought that Brexit would pass, but Brexit passed a few years ago. And of course, the big one within the context of recent American politics, very few people thought that Trump would win the 2016 election, but that's exactly what happened, right? So just think about it, 100 years from now, people are going to look back and say, wow, you guys were so surprised that Trump was elected. Well, obviously, people were dissatisfied with this and that. And it seems obvious from our vantage point in the year, 2120, that this, all of these forces, this confluence of forces were coming together to virtually guarantee Trump's election to the presidency. But if we're around during that time, or if we were there to listen to people talk like that, we would say, like, no, that's not a fair that's not a fair impression of what things were like in 2016. The vast majority of people, even people that supported Trump, thought that he was going to lose, and were totally flabbergasted by his election. Most political prognosticators, put the possibility of his election at 10% or 5% or 1%, and sure enough, he was elected to the presidency. So the point is not that what happened in the past is not important, and that we can't learn from the past to help to shape the present and make a better future. The point is to try and see things again from the point of view of those in the past. again, people 150 years from now might assume that Trump's election was unsurprising or even, quote, inevitable. But we know better because we live to see it. We live through it, right? So let's approach the past with the same spirit of, generosity and understanding to the extent that we can do that. So yeah, again, keeping this in mind, let's try and see things with the perspective of the people who lived in the United States since 1865, most of whom didn't see, for example, the rise of corporate industrial capitalism coming. They were surprised by the rise of the interventionist federal state in the early to mid 20th century. They were probably surprised by the inclusion of non-whites and women into the body politic. So women's suffrage doesn't happen, at least on the national level, until 1919. The inclusion, much closer to full inclusion of, for example, African Americans and other minorities into the body politic and protections for minorities on the basis of gender and race and sexual orientation doesn't really happen until the 1960s and 1970s, and those battles are still being waged to a large extent, right? So let's try and see things from their perspective, from the perspective of the people in the past. Okay. So my goal in this class, simply put, is to stimulate critical thinking about America's past in order to help you all become better citizens in a democratic society. Self-government, I think, requires a well-informed, thoughtful citizenry. And I want to play at least a small part. My goal is to help play a small part in helping to inculcate well-informed, thoughtful citizens. I'm trying to be a more well-informed, thoughtful citizen. I don't always succeed, but I'm trying to use history like within the context of that project. And obviously there's other things you can get from a history class like this. I think it has an applicability to other life skills, to other job skills as well. Certainly, my career in history started off, first history class I took in college was a history class like this, 100 level history class. So there might be a few people that get really interested in history and think they have a talent for it and continue to take more classes as an undergrad or go into graduate school. That's a whole other path, obviously. But so yeah, I think there's lots of different uses for a class like this. Obviously, most of you are using this to get a degree, to get the job you want, and to move up in the world. But democratic citizenship, I think, is important, and that's something that this class can help with, I think, or a class like this can help with. Okay, so that's it for video 1. Go ahead and click on video 2, and I'm going to talk about course logistics.